welcome back. I hope everyone enjoyed the breakout session of choice. Please do remember that there'll be a link that will circulate after event. So if you would like to have the insights and the benefits of both of our breakout sessions, but we're only able to attend one, please do get in touch with the team and we can share that content with you. A big thank you to Leslie and Richard, our two partner guest speakers today, who joined the ITC team to talk through the future of work and the challenges we have through identity and access management. Joining us now for our fireside chat, we have Admiral Mullen, who very graciously gave us a very thoughtful and insightful keynote earlier in the summit, and Sir Graeme, who joined us on the panel earlier. Good morning, Admiral Mullen, and good afternoon, and welcome again, Sir Graeme. Admiral Mullen, in your keynote, you mentioned cybersecurity as an existential threat to businesses and indeed to our nations. You went on to say that defense is no longer the answer, but that we need to think about how we move into offense, and also how do we move into anticipation and anticipating what the risks we might face. In the panel discussion earlier with Sir Graeme, we touched on very much the same topic, and therefore I'd like to put the first question out there and topic perhaps to Sir Graeme, over to you, as to how can we, particularly in the corporate world, think about offense and do more and do better there, so we aren't just reactive all the time.
That's fine, Arno. I mean, my sense is don't dismiss defense. In many ways, we got to get that part absolutely right, and what we do is I think we tend to look at defense at the moment just being a sort of series of linear. You go back and look at siege of a castle. There was the inner keep, there was the outer keep, there was a drawbridge, there was a moat. It was about defense in depth, which is an old military guide. The answer is, that was, I get that. And so when you look at defense, in many ways, it's this idea of defense in depth. It's, you got the end user, which is his or her knowledge about, in fact, phishing and all the rest, all the stuff that you need to do procedurally, plus the software they've got in their system when they're working from home, how they're captured within, in fact, what I call a company and an organization. And then the depth begins to come out when you reach out and then you sit within an unblinking eye. ITC is a good example of that, of where they're looking constantly at your specific space from a cyber attack point of view. And then that is, in fact, sitting within another envelope, which is in this case Microsoft, for instance, with ITC, who are genuinely putting quite literally billions of dollars into the program to ensure that they keep ahead of the threat seam and the threat analysis. And then that sits because they're able to, in fact, access and have a dialogue with the national cyber capabilities. That's defense in depth. The opposition can't match that. They can't match it. And so you need to have that in place. And within that, what you do is you provide, I think, from my point of view, the opportunity of therefore, in fact, beginning to think offensively. The idea, and Admiral Mullen started with it, you used the word anticipate. Is this idea of being able to anticipate? Churchill once said, you can only take, the chain of destiny one link at a time. And so you just need to look a little bit further of what's coming or what's happening out there in the emerging technology field to understand the nature of the attacks that you could face. You need to have that in order to be able to therefore prepare for what will be the unexpected attack that in fact will proliferate and it will in fact come down all the way to that end user.
Thank you very much, Sir Graeme. And perhaps then, if I put out a question that we received from the audience during the earlier session, but I think we have the perfect two individuals to help us answer this question. And there's been a lot of talk today during the summit and the questions sent in around the need to collaborate, the need for collaboration inside organizations, amongst peers, industries, but also nation states. So a question came in from Mike Truren, who's with the North Tyneside Council, a council here in England. And then the question was around to what extent the UK and US governments are collaborating, could do more, and how that could feed down into the public-private partnership to the benefit of end companies and individuals on the ground. Please.
Just, actually, I think you'd be surprised at the extent to which the two countries cooperate in this space. Within limits of their own laws. That's really been a challenge, and then extending that, quite frankly, to the private space. I felt for some time you can't beat this threat unless the public and the private sector get together. If I'm going to talk about sort of the ultimate collaboration right now, it would be that. And we've been through some real challenges with respect to trust in that regard, and I think we have to build it. But I don't think in the end, there's no way that we can handle this threat individually. You've seen this in industries where very competitive industries stayed away from each other for a long time and then just figured out they couldn't compete. They couldn't provide the kind of protection you need alone. And so they now collaborate where in places where you never thought that they would in the past. That's a sign of the time. It's a collaboration as we move forward, very specifically. And if I could just briefly, Arno, and this goes back to what Graeme's saying, if I were just going to take his point about Microsoft spending billions, as you know, the scale of the investment now is significant, matches the seriousness of the threat back to existential, whether it's nation state or businesses or individual. And it's how do we get ahead of that? And I'd like to be as far out in front of that as we possibly can. I'd like to understand the getting ahead technology as well as I do the investment in the technology that's going to make us safe from the standpoint of cyber defense and offense. And on the offensive side, we need to put them out of business. I mean, one of the things I talked about in my keynote is, we the worse it gets, the better the business is, quote unquote. That's not going to change overnight, but we need to figure out how do we put the bad guys out of business at every level, quite frankly. And oftentimes we don't do that. So, and I think a key, it's not just going to be, U.S. and the U.K., quite frankly. There's going to have to be collaboration across, globally, on these challenges, and we're nowhere near that.
Thank you very much. And Admiral Mullen, in your keynote, you also mentioned the desire and the need for us to create things more securely, create more secure applications, more secure code, and more secure hardware. You also rightly challenged me in some of my trends and predictions around the changing regulatory landscape. So if we can't drive that right intention behavior through regulation, how should we be approaching that? How can we create a bit of a carrot, perhaps, if regulation is the ill-fitting stick, to encourage organizations or to oblige them to create more, to take more time around the security of what they're creating and have a more secure world for everyone?
Well, as you look at the regulators, you oftentimes hear them talk about where we need to go from the standpoint of the regulation stand. Yet it takes, just because of the bureaucracy, and the legal systems, it takes far too long to put those regulations in place. How do I, as a company, create that regulation for me, knowing that that's what's coming, right now? And part of the challenge with that is always it's going to be more cost, more people, et cetera, and people don't like to spend money on it. It becomes a question of how much do you want to invest in the future? In ways it's almost a CapEx issue. It's a little different. How much do you want to invest in the future to make sure you're okay? And get there, quite frankly, before the regulators get there. And that's anathema. But if the regulators have it right, that we need to do certain things, and it's going to take them 5 years to get there, we need to get there quickly, assuming it's the right thing, for the overall system. Yeah,
and I would add, Admiral, I think that it comes back to, and I think it was probably you that said it, the idea of a moral compass. I sense that you might say that COVID's been an interesting, it's been a tragedy for many people. It's been a tragedy for the economy. It's been tragedy individually at homes and all the rest of it. But it's also, in fact, been an awakening. It's been a calling moment in many ways, which, China is now seen in a slightly different light from where it was in many ways before the great opportunity. Economic was all about, in fact, financial return. But what we've now got is, in fact, is a sense between that. You take the current situation in Ukraine. My sense is we're beginning to see the world beginning to sort of recall, you might say, return to the bad old days of where you can begin to sense and see where people are not necessarily your best friends. And therefore, it's really important for us, I sense, to somehow, as that comes in, then suddenly it's a sense that if I'm just going for the bottom line, I could be working with the enemy, or in effect, what is a mischievous or in fact a dangerous adversary here. Over.
We have to imagine where this technology and capability can go. And it can go for good and it can go for ill. And as we do that, as we put it out there, how do we counter the ill side? And I agree with you, Graeme. I think this is a somewhat of a unique time in terms of precipitating who's on what side very visibly again. And there may be an opportunity there to better understand, the downside of what we're trying to do, of software we're writing or hardware we're generating, and quite frankly, who we're partnering with. And when we're deeply embedded with China right now in a certain, not just technology, but certain business, my question for years has been, how long is that going to last? How long should it last? And is there a moral underpinning here, or do we just develop it, put it over the side and let somebody else figure that out and take the money up front? There's a lot of, and this is tough for the business side. There's a lot of things that need to be reviewed to make this, a business that actually can meet lots of needs, including the do for good and not so much for evil. But we don't think that through very much up front. We're compelled to get it out, tomorrow because somebody else is going to beat us. And I just think there needs to be more insight into what we're putting out as we stay in this business and try to get ahead of the enemy in ways that we haven't in the past.
Yeah, I mean, Admiral, it's a brilliant. So, when you were giving your opening remarks here, you said, looking back 10 years, and then you said, even looking back 20 years, the end of the day, the language. I remember sitting in, when you were chairman in 2007 with General Mattis, when he was running the JOE, the Joint Operational Environment piece of work for you, yeah, and when you asked General Jim then and said, General Jim Mattis, yeah, and said, so what's the one thing that keeps you awake at night, or that something of that probably more? He said digital dependence.
Yeah. And Arno, you and I've talked about it. I mean, I've literally, just in preparation for the keynote, I walked through the thought of, well, maybe I'll just drown my phone. I'll just get off the grid. And then when you start thinking that through, of how much of my life depends, is embedded in this, stupid little device, that I mean, it's an addiction that we all have. So how do we, and I'm not saying that should go away, but how do we look through the dependence on this to a much more survivable, much more optimistic, much more capable, and quite frankly, morally dependent future than it creates right now.
So it sounds like the General and Admiral, that the part of it needs to be creating the incentive and the onus on all of us and all of the companies to do better, to position that as more of a business enabler for them, and to differentiate their offering that they're putting out there against competitors who may be compromising the security, as you mentioned, for sales, for revenue, for growth, for deadlines. But there has to be that incentive that we need to create, it sounds like.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things I tried to say in the keynote is, we're the best minds. How do you think about this? So this is hard stuff. How do we invest in, the handful of people who actually could solve this? Where are they? How old are they? I think it's it's multi-generational to go find these people, but oftentimes we don't. We just don't look for them, because we do have, this year's budget, this year's sales target. We're pushing people hard to meet the numbers, almost no matter what, and we do that, which is a short-term gain, but very well could be a long-term loss.
Yeah, and I'd add that again, from an old soldier's perspective, is complacency is the absolute death knell, and the danger is, what we've done is we've been very comfortable with the opportunity that technology has afforded us, and how it's allowed us to accelerate, increase revenue streams. In fact, what I call make proof of concept, proof of value, you name it, all the rest. But the truth of the matter is, in fact, what we've just slightly blindsided the idea that, in fact, that that with that, to every force there is an equal and opposite. And the opposite, the downside of this is, in fact, people will look to exploit vulnerabilities, and they will, in fact, and those vulnerabilities will not just be to the individual and the company, but actually to our way of life. So I think, that's the part I see coming out of COVID, which I think in many ways, on the circumstances of, the geopolitical circumstances that we look at the world as it faces at the moment, which is in many ways, what I call a little concerning, but at the same time actually about, a wake-up call to turn around and say, we need to collectively, from the individual to the company, through, in fact, to our national and then our alliances, to recognize, in fact, the nature of this threat, because I'm absolute with the Admiral. I'm with you, Admiral Mullen, which is, this is potentially an existential threat. It could break, basically, people's faith in their nations.
But where that goes existential, I think I said this in the keynote as well, it is existential, and I've said this for a couple decades, to our country, but it is existential to businesses. It is existential to us as individuals. And what does that mean, and how do we think about that? Who's thinking about that? And how do we, it's one of those classic old statements, how do we do good while we're doing well? I mean, we need to, in this business, where the threat moves, the pace is so quick, how do you stay up with it? That's sort of been the MO. And part of this is the offense side. I think we need to figure out, and I agree with the defense and def piece, it's what I know, and it's what actually can probably give us the best shot. That said, we need to crush the bad guys on this. And on the commercial side, that's tough. That's a partnership, that's collaboration, those kinds of things. How do we do that? We're sort of at this moment, given where the technology is and given where the threat is, that we need to do that, in my view.
My interesting take on that, Admiral, would be that you more than I, but I managed to avoid it most of my military career, but the institutional inertia that sits within public sector is one which is a sort of a slowdown. It's a sea anchor, which in fact stops you moving quickly. The real pace can be managed within those organizations that are national organizations that are responsible for this and how they collaborate, and both across the nation, across the Atlantic and the like. But actually, in fact, in my personal view, I think it is the pace, almost at machine speed, that the likes of Microsoft, then you come through, in fact, the likes of organizations, ITC, can therefore make things happen so much faster.
I agree. I mean, we all know, most of us know Keith Alexander. He has said, for years, we need to move at the internet speed, basically, and that's really tough.
It's a challenge worth taking on. And Admiral Mullen, Sir Graeme, thank you very much for your thoughts and insights. We very much look forward to continuing that conversation with you in the next events we have coming up and some of the client interactions. But we've really enjoyed the conversation today. Thank you very much for your insights.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you very much, Admiral Mullen. Thank you, Sir Graeme.